Hello everyone, I am Demented Kirby, and welcome to my channel, the Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. The Brewery is a series on this channel showcasing my spicy brews and other deck text. On this episode of the Brewery, I will be discussing a new legendary creature from Throne of Eldraine, Questing Beast. Questing Beast is a 4/4 beast with Vigilance, Death Touch, and Haste for 2 generic and 2 green. Those are some crazy stats for a 4/4 for 4 mana. Notwithstanding, Questing Beast has 3 more abilities. It can be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less, so it has some form of evasion, which goes great with its 3rd ability because whenever it deals combat damage to an opponent, it deals that much damage to target planeswalker that player controls. If that weren't enough, its 2nd ability stops combat damage from your creatures from being prevented. In other words, if someone casts a darkness, only your creatures would deal combat damage. But I'll get into that synergy with the deck further on. Since Questing Beast is a 4/4 with Haste, Vigilance, Death Touch, and Slight Evasion, you might be tempted with building it as a Voltron commander. In theory, it's definitely possible. With so many zero-costed mana rocks and fast free mana like Lotus Petal, Elvish Spirit Guide, Chrome Mox, etc., it's certainly possible to have Questing Beast out on turn 1. However, it's still a 4/4, so it would need way more support for the Voltron strategy. Although you can go this route if it suits you, I found that there are better creatures for Voltron than Questing Beast. That being said, this deck leans heavily with creature-based strategies since the commander prevents the combat damage from your creatures to be prevented. So, although I built it without considering a consistent turn 1 Questing Beast, I did build it with plenty of cheap mana dorks like Birds of Paradise, Dryad Arbor, Elvish Mystic, Fyndhorn Elves, and Llanowar Elves, as well as Karametra's Acolyte for big mana, but I'll discuss that in greater detail later on. Out of these, the best one for most of the interactions in the deck is Dryad Arbor, but I'll get into that later on as well. Besides these mana dorks, I'm also running Soul Ring and Mana Crypt for efficient mana. Notwithstanding, land-based ramp is also included. Cultivate, Kodama's Reach, and Nissa's Pilgrimage each tutor for basic land to hand and the other to the battlefield. Nissa's Pilgrimage has the added bonus of putting 2 basic forests in your hand instead if you have Spell Mastery. Nature's Lure and 3 Visits each put a forest directly into play for just 1 mana. Traverse the Owllands can put a significant amount of lands into play if you cast it after casting Questing Beast. Doing so will get you 4 basic forests onto the battlefield, assuming that you haven't increased its power before the spell resolves. Harvest Season is great here because of all the mana dorks. If they're all tapped, then casting Harvest Season could get you a nice amount of mana. Even if you tap 3 dorks to cast it, you just got 3 basic forests onto the battlefield for just 3 mana. Although Nissa Who Shakes the World's ultimate makes all of these spells useless since she literally pulls all forests from out library and puts them into the battlefield, that's not the main reason for running her in this deck. Her static ability doubles the amount of mana produced by the forests we control. On top of that, her first ability animates a land while also untapping it. This can be used not only for mana acceleration but for combat as well. The deck can also generate a ton of mana with Nykthos, Shrine to Nyx, and Gaia's Cradle. Since Nissa is able to untap them with her first ability, that allows for some insane mana, even without Nissa, and you don't even need to generate so hard either. Untapping Ancient Tomb or Temple of the False God also works. This deck has an average CMC of 3.73, so it's important to maintain a steady flow of mana sources in order to not lose steam. Speaking of not losing steam, the deck also runs some card advantage with spells like Return of the Wild Speaker, Rishkar's Expertise, and Soul's Majesty. Return of the Wild Speaker is able to do what Soul's Majesty does, but at instant speed for the same exact mana cost, so long as the target isn't a human, that is. Rishkar's Expertise has the added bonus of allowing you to cast a card with converted mana cost 5 or less from your hand when it resolves. That way you at least get most of your mana back, so to speak. Besides spells, the deck takes advantage of being creature-heavy with creature-based card advantage. Beast Whisperer and Primordial Sage draw us a card whenever we cast a creature spell. Guardian Project draws us a card whenever a creature enters the battlefield under our control with a different name, something that's not a problem in Commander. Other draw sources are from combat damage against players. Keeper of Fables and Oran Frostfang have an effect where we draw a card for each creature we control that deals combat damage to a player. In the case of Keeper of Fables, that creature has to be non-human. Oran Frostfang has the added bonus of giving Death Touch to all of our attacking creatures. We can also draw into a bunch of cards thanks to our planeswalkers. Freyalise Llanowar's Fury's ultimate allows us to draw a card for each green creature we control. Additionally, she creates a mana dork as well as being able to naturalize with her second ability. Garruk Primal Hunter's second ability draws us cards equal to the power of our strongest creature. On top of that, his first ability creates a 3/3 beast which can be used to protect him, while his ultimate creates as many 6/6 worm creatures as lands we control, which should be quite considerable on account of all the ramping. Alright, so now that we've seen how to burn through the deck, what is it that we want to achieve? It won't be easy to win via commander damage, so we're going to take advantage of Questing Beast's abilities as well as the high creature count of the deck. As I mentioned in the beginning of the video, Questing Beast ignores combat damage prevention abilities affecting our own creatures. That means that it will still affect opponents' creatures. So, as long as we're fogging during combat, our creatures won't die from combat damage, but our opponents' creatures probably will. One of the best cards for this is perhaps Bubble Matrix. Bubble Matrix doesn't simply prevent all combat damage that creatures receive, but burn damage also. However, with Questing Beast on the battlefield, our opponent's creatures receive combat damage from our creatures while our creatures don't receive combat damage from theirs. However, this doesn't prevent combat damage to us. So if an opponent has a stompy deck and send a bunch of trample damage our way, it might be game over. So why not continue the fog route in order to also protect ourselves as well? Spike Weaver is a great way to continuously prevent combat damage. By paying 1 and removing a +1/+1 counter from it, you prevent all combat damage that would be dealt that turn. Spike Weaver would need ways of recovering those +1/+1 counters as the game drags on, but fortunately the deck has ways to do so. The inclusion of such effects aren't simply for Spike Weaver's benefit, they also work well on their own in the deck. Loyal Guardian places a +1/+1 counter on all of our creatures at the beginning of our combat step if we control Questing Beast. Bow of Nylea can also be used to place a +1/+1 counter on Spike Weaver. If that weren't enough, the bow also gives Death Touch to all of our attacking creatures. We can also use its activated ability to deal 2 damage to target flying creature, gain 3 life, or bottom deck up to 4 cards from our graveyard. Nissa, Voice of Zendikar, can also put a +1/+1 counter on all our creatures. She can also create a 0/1 plant token to protect herself. Her ultimate is also relevant in the deck since we can use it to gain a bunch of life and draw a bunch of cards thanks to all our ramping. Since the deck runs some ways of getting +1/+1 counters, plus it contains a couple of planeswalkers, Karn's Bastion is included. Not only can it give something to do with extra mana if there's nothing else to cast, but since the deck is monocolored, it's not a useless land if there aren't any counters to proliferate, since it can still tap for colorless. Alright, so that's the support for Spike Weaver, but that's not the only way to consistently fog. One of those is Constant Mists. Constant Mists is quite literally constant fog. You just sacrifice a land to its buyback cost and it returns to your hand for constant use. Another similar ability that requires land destruction to abuse is Sunstone. Sunstone is the reason why the deck runs 25 snow-covered forests. By paying 2 generic and sacrificing a snow land, and without tapping, it fogs. Since the deck is constantly ramping, there should be more than enough lands to cover these destructive costs. Besides, the deck also runs mana dorks and rocks to get mana via non-land sources. Either way, Crucible of Worlds, Ramunap Excavator, and Azusa Lost But Seeking are included to help smooth over the land sacrifice dilemma. Crucible of Worlds and Ramunap Excavator let you play lands from the graveyard, but Azusa lets you play 2 additional lands per turn, just in case you have to cast Constant Mist or activate Sunstone multiple times before your next turn. Either way, these cards are great on their own when not just used for fogging. The deck runs Misty Rainforest, Verdant Catacombs, Windswept Heath, and Wooded Foothills to not only thin the deck of lands, but being able to play lands from the graveyard means that each fetch land is a forest a turn. Plus, these lands also fetch for Dryad Arbor, which we'll see in a moment why this card is so good in the deck. Another constant fog effect is with Dawnstrider. It literally turns any card in your hand into a fog. You pay 1, tap it, discard a card, and that's it. The deck runs plenty of ways to abuse this ability over and over without having to worry about having cards in hand. For example, some of the ramp spells place one of the lands tutored for into your hand. That gives you a card to ditch. However, the best card for this interaction is the aforementioned Dryad Arbor. If you have Timur Sabertooth in play, it can bounce any creature to your hand, which you can then pitch to John Strider in case of emergency. However, if you bounce Dryad Arbor, you can discard that for the Fog effect. Then, with Crucible of Worlds or Ramunap Excavator, you can play Dryad Arbor from the graveyard as a land. Then do it all over again. Since we are abusing our graveyard for lands hijinxes, I run Elixir of Immortality just to be on the safe side. It also makes my deck larger and gains me 5 life. While on the topic of Temur Sabertooth, this creature also works synergistically with the deck to make full use of the creatures in the deck. Not only because bouncing creatures to recast them triggers the abilities from Beast Whisperer and similar cards, but because the deck contains creatures with Enter the Battlefield abilities. Since the premise of the deck is attacking with total disregard, since we can prevent all combat damage except from our own creatures, it's preferable for the deck to run its fair share of creatures. That's why the deck runs creatures that can be useful when they enter the battlefield and then be bodies to either attack or chump block. Meteor Golem, Whip-Tongue Hydra, Acidic Slime, Reclamation Sage, Terastodon, Bane of Progress, and Duplicant. These creatures are good regardless if I'm bouncing them or not, since they're removal on a body. Meteor Golem blows up any permanent. Whip-Tongue Hydra straight up kills all creatures with flying, all while getting +1/+1 counters for it. Reclamation Sage blows up an artifact or enchantment, while Acidic Slime can do the same, but also has the option of blowing up a land as well. Oh, and it has Death Touch. Terastodon can blow up 3 non-creature permanents at the cost of giving their controllers a 3/3 elephant creature token for each permanent destroyed this way, but who cares since they can't hit us or our creatures anyways. Bane of Progress destroys all artifacts and enchantments, all while getting +1/+1 counters for it. And Duplicant exiles a creature, bypassing Indestructible. Although Steelbane Hydra doesn't destroy anything when it enters the battlefield, it does enter with X +1/+1 counters on it, which can be removed at the cost of 3 mana in order to destroy an artifact or enchantment. Although not a creature, Scour from Existence is just such great instant speed removal that gets around a lot of things. In a deck that produces so much mana, it's not so out of place to include. Another great removal spell is Wave of Vitriol. This really sets back multicolored decks as well as decks that are very dependent on artifacts and enchantments. These are the kinds of decks that can keep back our progress, such as Pull of Fort decks and other types of locking, taxing decks. Besides removal effects, recovery effects can also be found on creatures with Enter the Battlefield abilities. Eternal Witness can return any card from your graveyard to your hand, while Whipsweeper can return any card from your exile to your graveyard. Used in conjunction, they can essentially return any card from exile to your hand. 2 of the main win cons from the deck also come with an Enter the Battlefield trigger, Avenger of Zendikar and Craterhoof Behemoth. With all the previously mentioned land recycling hijinxes previously mentioned, the amount of +1/+1 counters that will be placed on those plant tokens is ridiculous. Oh, keep in mind that Nissa Voice of Zendikar also creates plant tokens. All those plant tokens form quite the impressive army, which can be used to smash face. Craterhoof Behemoth is just a given in a deck with so many cheap creatures. This is one of the main ways to give questing beasts enough pump to crash through and take out an opponent with commander damage, while the rest of your army takes out the others. If you need to cast all these things at instant speed for any reason, at least Vidalcan Orrery can go in any deck. It gives all of our spells flash, so we can also keep things a surprise with the element of speed. On the topic of win cons, the deck is meant to enter combat whenever it's most convenient. Thus, the deck also includes Beastmaster Ascension to beef up all of our creatures after it gets enough counters. Victory can also come from Nylea, God of the Hunt, giving all our creatures trample as well as providing a mana sink that can make huge and unblocked creature, preferably Casting Beast. That reminds me. As mentioned early on in the video, Karametra's Acolyte can generate big mana, infinite mana in fact. Although I explained that combo in great detail in my Polukranos World Eater decklist video, which you can find in the link above, I'll just insert here an excerpt of that section of the video so you can see what I mean. Along with Karametra's Acolyte and a source of haste like Lightning Greaves, you can produce infinite mana if you have a devotion to green of 7. Tap the Acolyte for 7 green mana. Use 2 of that mana to activate Temur Sabertooth, sending the Acolyte to your hand. Use 4 of the remaining mana to cast it. You now have 1 green mana left in your mana pool. Equip the Greaves to the Acolyte, and then tap it again to add 7 more green mana to your mana pool. Rinse and repeat. In a mono green deck, this is definitely viable, especially with all the green permanents with a high green chroma. Pretty awesome, right? Alright, moving along. I just mentioned pumping up an unblockable creature, and Rogue's Passage can do just that, providing an unblocked fatty for just 4 mana and tapping. It can also tap for colorless when needed for mana, which isn't a problem in a monocolored deck. Eldrazi Monument is also a great way to provide even more pain to our opponents via our creatures, since they get flying, indestructible, and +1/+1. And if you have to sacrifice a creature each upkeep, that's not such a problem. The best way to circumvent that downside is with Dryad Arbor and Ramunap Excavator or Crucible of Worlds, as previously mentioned. You can just sacrifice Dryad Arbor to the Monument's trigger and then play it from the graveyard afterwards with the Crucible. The Synergy. Since one of the main reasons these synergies work is due to our commander, we gotta protect it. Although it has built-in haste, Swiftfoot Boots and Lightning Greaves are included for the Hexproof and Shroud respectively, more so than the haste. Whispersilk Cloak is also included for the Shroud, but it has the added bonus of unblockable in case you really need to get a creature through. The last equipment of the lineup is Loxodon Warhammer. That way, Questing Beast can become a 3-turn clock that can also gain us life. If the damaged opponent also has a Planeswalker in play, then the damage dealt to it by Questing Beast also gains us life. On the topic of protection, the deck can't go wrong running Rapid Vigor, Heroic Intervention, and Inspiring Call. Inspiring Call is the only situational one out of the 3, but the deck has enough creatures with +1/+1 counters on it or ways to get those counters that it's worth including. This brew is just an idea of how to build around Questing Beast. With so much potential and routes to take, this is definitely a fun commander to build around. As far as my own spicy brew, you can find my current deck list for this commander down in the description. I would like to thank all my patrons for supporting me, and a quick shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the brewers, for their patronage. And to everyone, thanks for watching this episode of The Brewery on the Commander Tavern. I am Demented Kirby, and happy brewing.